It's on opioid use disorder in adolescents and young adults. The second will be prevention of adolescent binge drinking, a neurodevelopmental view. Dr. Compton is going to give our initial presentation. Wilson, come on up.
Thank you, Frank. Well, nice to see everybody. Wait a minute, I was just here. I want to loop back around actually before I get started in that Dr. Koob was asked about how to change attitudes around medications related to alcohol use disorder. And I think the same question can apply to all substance use disorder where we have medications. And I would suggest that you all in the room are key in helping to change attitudes. You all are the experts. And so the messages that you can bring back to your colleagues and your local communities to make sure that where possible you emphasize the role of effective evidence-based approaches in the treatment of drug use disorders will be essential in changing this dialogue. So while we can do some of that at a national level, it really will depend on a great deal because most of us get most of our information from our trusted colleagues and friends, much more than from some campaign that we might launch or some other. So we'll give you the tools, but you all are essential in changing this situation. All right, so if I could have my first slide, please. What I've got for you today is a rapid discussion around opioid use issues for opioid use disorder in youth. So we're going to switch from sort of the global, what are we doing in terms of research generally around opioids, to focus specifically on youth populations. And I've already suggested to you about some of the issues related to overdose. I did that in the last session. I like this map because it reminds us that the overdose deaths, while they've increased everywhere, are particularly acute in some parts of the country. And so pay attention to your local situation. Drug use disorders and substance use problems are inherently spread person to person, and so they are very dependent on local factors, and you need to be aware of whether are you in one of the cocaine areas, or are you a methamphetamine area, what's going on in terms of what particular opioids are used in your location. That'll play a role in your practice. And I'm going to skip this one because I did this already for you. So when we look at the overdose deaths, there's some very interesting data about which populations, which age groups are most impacted. And while every age group is impacted, that with the highest death rate, whether we look at the overall number of deaths, the rate of overdose deaths, or the years of life lost, which of course is a combination of the number of deaths times the age at which those deaths occur. And we see that the 25 to 34-year-old age group has the highest rate and the highest numbers. So it's not truly the adolescents or the very early adult, but is that sort of young adult, early adult area that has been most impacted by the end stage and the most severe consequence. Well, that tells us that the problems are beginning a little bit before that. So that's why the emphasis on youth in terms of prevention and young adults in terms of intervention will be so essential in reducing this most severe outcome of the overdose, of the opioid crisis. Now, we've highlighted for you the availability of opioids as driving this epidemic, and particularly the prescription opioid deaths. And you already heard a little bit about where people get their prescriptions. This is data from the Monitoring the Future study, so highlighting for youth, it's the same as we see in the general adult population. Most young adults and most teenagers that are misusing opioids get them from their friends and relatives. Their own prescription, though, is also an important source. So I want you to keep in mind that it's both the secondary access through prescriptions that were to someone else, as well as the direct prescriptions that can be the start of a substance-using career and a substance-using trajectory. We know from Monitoring the Future that medical prescriptions for opioids during the 12th grade, during the senior year of high school, can predict who's going to be misusing opioids 5 years later. So the longitudinal studies suggest to us that these medical prescriptions are not innocent bystanders, but so there's a reason not to expose youth unnecessarily. It doesn't mean we don't provide them when they're necessary, but we ought to minimize unnecessary exposures. We have seen some real improvements in the rates of misuse of the stimulants, of opioids. We see Vicodin as a specific substance that's questioned in the Monitoring the Future study has dropped considerably over the last few years. It was endorsed by about 10% of high school seniors about a decade ago, and those numbers are now down to 2.5% or 3%. Some of that has to do with the scheduling changes for these hydrocodone compounds, but it also has to do with the prevention activities and the hard work that many communities have been doing to change the messages about the riskiness of prescription opioids. I remember when I first saw the 10% rate around high school seniors, I didn't believe it. I thought Vicodin, maybe vitamins were used by 10% of high school seniors. I couldn't believe that many high school seniors were using Vicodin. But we've certainly learned from multiple studies the veracity of that information, and it's really good to see the numbers beginning to trend downwards. We also see trends in heroin use by youth tending downwards. So we are making some progress in terms of the onset of these conditions, but that's not who ends up getting into our clinical settings. The numbers of people with an opioid use disorder have not tended down so much. Now, when we look at the overall federal strategies, these include both prevention approaches to reduce the exposure to opioids. We look at rescue approaches, which is enhanced access to naloxone to save lives when somebody has overdosed. We look at broad-based prevention activities as well as enhanced treatment and recovery services as key components of changing the outcomes in communities. I'm also pleased that our federal Department of Health and Human Services emphasizes the need for better data and research to address this. That's not always included in health initiatives, and yet research will pave the way towards improvements in the long run. Now, I'm going to take a step back. That's just to lay some of the groundwork about the importance of this issue, some general trends in opioid misuse among youth that do show some improvements. But I want to highlight for you this slide, which reminds us that drug use disorders, addiction, are the product not just of our innate nature. In other words, it's not all predestined based on our genetic background. It's not all based on our environment, how our parents raised us, the exposure to traumas, or exposure to difficult environments, or neighborhoods that are high risk. But it's the combination of those two that work together sometimes, both to protect or to put people at risk that lead to addiction. And it's studying these combinations that's led to an awful lot of insights. We also are able to change the environment in many times to lead to improved outcomes. That's the hallmark of prevention, is that we can't change your innate risk from a biological standpoint, at least not today, but we certainly can change your environment and reduce your risks in the long run. I'll show you some positive examples of that. This has resulted in multiple publications. We have the principles of drug abuse treatment for children and adolescents, and more recently, looking at principles of interventions for infants and very young children, reminding us that the pathways into drug abuse and drug addiction can be established through infancy and very early factors that can be changed. So we see things like the Nurse Home Partnership program targeting infants to about 2 years, birth to about 2 years old, having long-term impacts on drug use. Now, here's an example where it specifically takes this concept and applies it to the opioid use crisis. We now have 3 large-scale community-based trials documenting that middle school interventions that were either the Strengthening Families 10 to 14 program or the Life Skills Training Program, or combinations of the two, can have long-lasting impacts on the onset of, at least in this case, prescription opioid and more broadly, prescription drug misuse. I think that's kind of remarkable. When these interventions are implemented with 12 and 13-year-olds, they're emphasizing with families their ability to provide loving, nurturing environments and appropriate supervision. It's a very general message to the families. It's working with the children to address their skills, some of their refusal skills, but also their competence in school. These are risk and protective factors that can be shaped at an early age. 10 years later, when we come back and look at how these kids are doing, turns out they're much less likely to misuse opioids. So this is an example of how we can shape the environment early on in life and have a lasting impact. Dick Spoth and colleagues have reminded us these can be very cost-effective approaches. And so I encourage you, if you're working with your local communities, to be thinking about these prevention approaches as a tool that's frequently overlooked in addressing the onset of prescription opioid misuse and reducing all sorts of negative health outcomes. Today's issue is opioids, but these same approaches may improve outcomes across a range of factors. Okay, we've certainly seen increasing rates of treatment for opioid use disorder in youth coming out of claims data. So this shows how much work you all have in terms of treating particularly young adults with opioid use disorder. I'm very pleased that our clinical trials network did some of the formative research to remind us that buprenorphine can be useful for a younger population than it was originally studied. So buprenorphine has, at least in a small number of studies, been shown to be effective for youth with opioid use disorder. An issue, though, is that just like for adults, we have very limited access to medication-assisted treatment. So while this is an issue for all populations, it's even more accentuated for adolescents versus adults. So when you look at those ages 15 to 17 with an opioid use disorder compared to those ages 18 and older, the potential access to medication-assisted treatment is just remarkably low. So I feel I have concern for 16-year-olds who have an opioid use disorder, because as hard as it is to gain treatment and get access to treatment when you're 20, 21, or 25, if you're 15 or 16, the ability to access those treatments in your local community may be significantly curtailed. A key barrier, though, relates to the complexity of our treatment system. And that's why, the discussion with Dr. Everett and colleagues from SAMHSA are so important, because that's a way that we can develop new research approaches to treating these conditions. But if I don't have a treatment system that can adopt them, we're in big trouble. So what can we do to develop interventions like Dr. Koob described in terms of practices to help families who have children who have substance use problems access care, or help clinicians do a better job of being aware of their local resources to make sure that their patients in general medicine have access to care. This is a key barrier for all of our patients, and it's particularly true for the adolescents. Now, I'll highlight for you just for a moment that justice-involved youth are a particular risk. We see this in terms of data from the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, that for youth that have involvement in the juvenile justice system, they're much more likely to have all sorts of substance use problems. We see this in the Monitoring Future study as well, that having an arrest means you have a much higher risk of using heroin or using or having any illicit drug use. So just an example of how justice systems and illicit substance use are intimately connected to one another. NIDA launched our Juvenile Justice Initiative a few years ago, and this is really a systems-based approach to how can we integrate juvenile justice with the treatment systems in their communities. And we're just beginning to see some of the results of this project. So I encourage you to pay attention to the evolving literature coming out of the JJ trials, our Juvenile Justice Initiative. We've certainly shown with early research from this program the lack of access to care. But the question is, how can we do a better job of improving treatment by equipping juvenile justice settings the tools that they need to assess the youth adequately and then allocate them to the correct resource, whether that's a prevention intervention for those who are at very low, who aren't exhibiting the behaviors at baseline, or treatment interventions for those a little further down the pathways. I'll just highlight for you, to wrap up, some of the highlights from our current investments. We're certainly focusing in the broad range of issues related to adolescent opioid use disorder, whether that's understanding the transition from opioid misuse to injection drug use and full-blown opioid use disorder. It's been very difficult to study that. These are hidden populations that really don't always want to be involved in research, and it's also a fairly low prevalence condition. So it's difficult to design the projects, but we're excited by some of the projects that have been looking at that transition into injection drug use as, of course, the one of the most dangerous and concerning transitions in a drug use trajectory. We've been focusing on prevention activities, both those broad-based prevention approaches I've highlighted for you. We just had a meeting recently that targeted the idea of we need better prevention for emerging adulthood. If the problems related to the opioids are are developing during late adolescence and early adult life, and they're not developing directly during the teen years. It's mostly a little bit later on. Well, we don't really have any prevention programs targeting these conditions for that age group. There's been a lot on college drinking, but we've had much less emphasis on illicit drugs during that emerging adulthood population. And indeed, we're going to have to think beyond the college setting, because most of this substance use is not in the kids who are in universities or in colleges, but they're out in the community, either working or unemployed. So we have a new set of challenges, and we look forward to your best ideas about how to reach those populations. Of course, we're focusing on improvement, treatment, and services. I would say one of our key goals is to determine how long do we need to treat people with an opioid use disorder? This is a question I get all the time, and my answer is long-term, but I can't be much more specific than that. And particularly when it comes to treating adolescents or young adults who may not have had the 20 years of lifetime use of opioids in a heavy way, I think the question of how long to treat them is a very important one, and that we need to turn our attention to it. We are focusing on this now and are looking forward to trying to figure out how best to address those key questions which can inform your practice programs. Now, I ended with this in my last talk, and I'll end with it again, that I think that I highlighted for you the interaction of environments with our individual factors in the onset of these conditions. And I think that reminds us of both the developmental nature of these disorders as well as the potential for interventions that involve both treatment and multiple aspects of the environment to both to prevent the onset of these conditions and improve the outcomes. Because while we're going to focus on the opioid use disorder, there's an awful lot else to treating and helping people recover that involves legal issues, psychiatric problems, family issues that you all deal with every day that we need to think about if we're going to have a full, that maximize the supports and improve the outcomes for these affected youth and adults. Thanks very much for your attention. I didn't leave a lot of time, but I left a couple of minutes for any questions or comments, and I'm not sure whether I'm allowed to take any now, or if not, we'll turn it over to Dr. Koob, but I'm going to be here both during the session and afterwards, so if you have questions. Okay, we do have a few. Thank you. This is my favorite part. Okay. I do have a couple of audience response questions based on what I presented to you or what you've heard. So you're allowed to use your audience response and see if you were paying attention. Which age group has been most highly impacted by opioid overdoses? Would it be the birth to 14 years old, the 15 to 24, the 25 to 34, the 35 to 44, the 45 to 54, the 55 to 64, or the 65 and older? Which one has had the most highly impacted by opioid overdoses? Please answer that. It should be the Jeopardy song, please. No, it's okay. Most people got that right. Thank you. I would suggest that every age group can be seriously impacted by this, and so we're all open to treating patients at at all ages. What's the most common source of prescription opioids for adolescents that misuse these medications? And I hope you'll get this one right. Is it their own prescription, family and friends, drug dealers, or the internet? And this is for the broad population that misuse these substances. Okay, thank you. I'm glad everybody got that right. You've heard that multiple times here. But I think it reminds us of the importance of prevention involving family and friends. I also think that message that youth have that these drugs must be safe because they come from prescriptions is still an impression we need to address. Now that buprenorphine has been shown to be effective in treating youth opioid use disorder, the rates of treatment have increased so that the majority of drug treatment programs offering services to youth with opioid use disorder provide access to buprenorphine and/or other medications. True or false? Thank you. I hope you understand. Now it's worded a little sideways for those that didn't get that correct. In general, buprenorphine and other medication-assisted treatment are not offered to most of the patients that need it. That's really a scandal, I think, for our whole country, and one that I know all of you are doing what you can to address. All right, I think that was my opportunity to provide some audience interaction. Are there some questions for me? Okay. The disorder may start in a 12-year-old or younger, but treatment in an outpatient treatment program is only allowed among those 18 and above, unless there's parental involvement. Will the age limit change at some point? I think that there's a reason to think that we certainly need to make sure that the services are available to those under age 18. There's nothing magical about the age of 18 that means you weren't at risk before that and suddenly you are. And so particularly those in the 16 to 17-year-old range, we need to be paying attention to. But I don't know anything that's going to change the regulations right now. You got another one for me?
Sure, here's a good one.
Oh, how can we access the adolescent prevention tools to prevent opioid use? Well, I highlighted for you the strengthening parents, strengthening SFP for 10 to 14. Used to be called the Iowa Strengthening Families Program, but it's Strengthening Families Program 10 to 14 and Life Skills Training. You can access those online. I also encourage you to contact directly Dr. Richard Spoth, S-P-O-T-H, who's at Iowa State, who studied these programs and certainly can highlight them for you. Regarding the information on NIDA's website, more generally around prevention, that's available easily on our website. If you can't find it in a couple of clicks, send me an email and I'll point you in the right direction.
Here's an old services question.
How do we invite communities of color, they're especially youth of color, into medication-assisted treatment? Well, I think there's a real issue of, in general, how do we get youth to be interested and willing to consider medication-assisted treatment? And so making our treatments more friendly and more consumer-friendly to all populations, both persons of varying ethnicity as well as different sexual orientations, is a challenge for all of us. How do we make sure that we create a welcome, open environment and provide care that's sensitive to the needs of these different populations is key. I think we have a general issue in making treatment more acceptable to all adolescents and all youth. That's a broad challenge that we all face, and I don't have a complete answer to that, but that's certainly something that could be amenable to research paradigms and research questions.
Another services question, Maura.
I feel most challenged in my practice speaking with my under 30 patients who have never lived with an adult brain not on substances. What counseling? I like this. In other words, the families all have substance use problems, let alone they haven't lived with their own without substances. What counseling methods are most effective for this cohort? I don't think we have answers to that we'll look at the details of which counseling methods, but I encourage you to work with your colleagues who are expert in cognitive behavior therapy, which has been shown to be effective across a number of conditions. Plus looking at motivational interviewing as a way to at least looking at ways to keep patients engaged in the long run. Those are at least a couple of things that come to my mind based on the research literature. But I think this is an area where collaboration with colleagues will be essential for you.
All right, here's one. You can't read it. I can read it for you.
Is there any funding going on towards nutrition and supplemental therapy for those suffering from substance use disorders? We haven't focused extensively on the interaction between eating behaviors and food intake or nutrition and substance use disorder treatment. We've certainly looked at that from sort of a basic science and neuroscience perspective in terms of the common circuitry of eating behaviors and substance use problems. But we haven't looked at that in terms of treatment opportunities. So I'd be curious what you're observing in your practices, and might there be promising areas that could be developed? That's the kind of thing we're open to. Although I want to make sure that there's at least some preliminary evidence for us to engage in a full-scale intervention trial.
All right, the last one. This is about buprenorphine diversion.
What are the thoughts on increased street access to Suboxone with the increased prescribing through MAT programs? Well, of course, everyone's concerned about diversion of buprenorphine and trying to minimize that. We balance the needs of increased access to medication with whenever we increase availability, we will have some diversion. That's notorious in the medical field. Almost anything that we provide will be diverted and not used according to the label or according to recommendations. That's not limited to our field, although in our field it becomes an issue because you can perpetuate the addiction issues for a community with too much access to these medications. The issue around buprenorphine, some have proposed that access diversion may actually be used to treat withdrawal by some people who are not in treatment. I would suggest that we still want people to get into treatment and not be treating themselves. There's a reason these are controlled substances and require your prescriptions and your supervision of the patients. I'm pleased to see the new longer-acting formulations of buprenorphine, the injectable formulations, as a new alternative. And so that might open up pathways for higher-risk patients. Because I do think there are some populations where we wouldn't want to send them out with a prescription of buprenorphine because they're too high risk for diverting it. And yet some of the injection medications may provide a new way of addressing those patients' needs. Okay. Thank you very much for your attention. I'll stick around afterwards if you want to talk to me personally.
We'll now have Dr. Koob. He's going to talk about prevention of adolescent binge drinking and a neurodevelopmental viewpoint.
Well, thank you. There I am. Okay, so what I'd like to do is tell you some of the things we're doing at NIAAA in regards to underage drinking and adolescent drinking. And I'm going to tell you two sides of a story. One is that I'm going to argue that we've had a good bit of success, and you've seen some of those slides, and I'm going to go through some of those slides quickly. But there has been, as Deborah Hassan pointed out this morning, a steady decline in underage drinking in the United States over the last 20, almost 30 years. But that doesn't mean we don't still have a problem in double negatives here. So about 1 in 10 of adolescents drink each month, and about half of them binge drink, and that remains today. And nearly 3 of 5 young adults drink each month, and 2/3 of them binge drink. And so, you know, we had 50,000 people aged 12 to 17 and 293,000 aged 18 to 24 visit emergency departments in 2014 for reasons related to acute intoxication. And I always tell people, at least when I was in San Diego County, if you went to the emergency room on a Friday or Saturday night, half the people in the emergency room were there because of alcohol. Fewer than half of adolescents and young adults are asked about alcohol use during physician visits. You heard a talk earlier today by Connie Weisner about brief interventions, and others talked about that and how effective they are. And more than 1/3 of adolescents and young adults do not see a great risk and harm in binge drinking nearly every day. And I'll talk about that in a little bit further. And then gender gaps continue to narrow, and research on alcohol and brain development continues to provide evidence of risks. So there's some success, and I think we're quite proud of that, but there's also some challenges. So I'm just going to talk about some of these overall declines. I already told you that. I'm going to talk that some people are drinking at levels far beyond what we even consider a binge. And we've covered this extensively, so I'll go through it very quickly. The gaps between males and females are narrowing. If you didn't catch that before, I'm going to emphasize that. And then brain research continues to move forward to identify that alcohol in the adolescent brain has particularly deleterious effects. So again, we've seen these slides. There's a decrease in annual drinking. This has been going on since basically 1975. And this is the good news. There's a decrease in binge drinking, even in 12th graders. And this is also good news. But I'm not sure that you really want still 17% of 12th graders in the United States binge drinking, okay? And there's been a decrease in binge drinking actually in college-age young adults. But again, if you look at the absolute numbers there, you're talking about 33%. That means 1 out of 3, all right? That means 1 out of 3 of your kids that are in college are binge drinking. And the non-college is I would say, almost a similar value. And then you've heard this a lot, so I'm not going to dwell on it, but if you look at the circles, you can see that in college and in non-college, the gap is narrowing between males and females in young adults as to actual binge drinking. So we now have women, percentage-wise, almost the same as males in their binge drinking. In the adolescent age group. Why are these so concerning? Well, as you've already heard from our symposium earlier today, recent studies suggest that alcohol affects females and males differently. Progression, I've already said this, of alcohol use to alcohol use disorder, but also the pathophysiology associated with excessive alcohol use is faster in women. Alcohol-induced cirrhosis has been on the rise among women aged 18 to 34. We talk on a fairly regular basis with the group at Hopkins that does liver transplants. They've been telling us that they've been seeing younger and younger individuals that they actually do liver transplantations in. And we know very little about why. And I already told you about the structural imaging studies and how only about a quarter of them have actually looked at the differences between males and females, even though they measured males and females in the studies. And then some individuals are drinking far beyond what we consider a binge. Now, I'll just remind you, it was on the previous slide, but a binge at NIAAA is reaching 0.08 in 2 hours. I'll repeat that, reaching 0.08 in 2 hours. That's the legal limit. On average, that means for females, 4 drinks in 2 hours, and for males, 5 drinks. What do I mean by a drink? Well, the standard drink. If you don't know what a standard drink is that's defined by NIAAA, it's on Rethinking Drinking, one of our websites. And that becomes important, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But then if you look at 12th graders, young people drinking 15 drinks in a setting is 3.1%. In college, it's 1.3%, and in non-college, it's around 5%. And we call this high-intensity drinking. And we actually just had a meeting on this last week. Actually, it was this week. Time goes fast when you're in IAAA. And I brought in what I call a Noah's Ark group of individuals. So I had individuals who work in the media domain. I had individuals who are pediatric psychiatrists. I had individuals who study adolescent drinking in college domains. We had 2 cultural anthropologists. And we spent the whole day discussing what exactly is driving this extreme binge drinking. And for those of you who've seen Risky Drinking, we showed it once here at ASAM, the documentary we did with HBO and NIAAA. The first vignette is a group of women who are partying, and HBO very cleverly measures the number of drinks they're partaking of as they move from party to party. And even though they announce, these young women, that for the whole evening they're going to have 4 or 5 drinks, which is not for 7 hours or 8 hours, is probably not totally outrageous. I don't recommend it, but the fact is they haven't even gotten to the 3rd party, and they've charted already 10 to 15 drinks in these individuals. They keep a little tick going on the left-hand corner. So I don't have a slide for this, but one of the things that just came out of this meeting was that I found fascinating was context. What's driving this is context, and in the very broad sense of the word context. So that means social context, social relationships, peers, media context, what they see on these in YouTube and other media about what other people are doing. We are so much primates, and when we see what another primate is doing, we mimic what the other primate is doing. Standards. So one of you asked me earlier today, what do you do about your kid who's reaching those teenage years? Well, standards is critical. If the parents are drinking excessively, if the friends of the parents are drinking excessively, the child is going to see that. And so that becomes a big issue. And you know, in the prevention field, I've often heard, well, education doesn't work. But I think it depends on what education you're talking about. One of the things that came out of this meeting is how virtually everyone agreed that probably these young people can't even define what a drink is. They don't know what's in their mixed drink. They don't know that 2 shots of vodka is a lot worse than a large beer from the point of view of alcohol content. And I'm not trying to sell one or the other, okay? I could get in trouble for that. And then something biological fell out of this meeting that really astounded me because I'm as many of you know, I'm such a dark sider. But what about tolerance? What about that inherent tolerance that some people carry around from a genetic loading? Possibly the work of Mark Schuckett I refer you to. But what about the fact that young people may be developing tolerance or not developing tolerance depending on their situation? Or maybe they have an inherent tolerance, but that this could be contributing. They don't know that they've actually ingested that much alcohol. And tolerance is differential, all right? So you can learn to drive under the influence. I'm not going to go into any personal histories, but you know, in my generation, people learned to drive a car under the influence of alcohol. But when you're driving a car under the influence of alcohol and navigating through different things, first your reaction time stays impaired because tolerance doesn't develop to that. And your vision that's impaired, tolerance doesn't develop to that. Anyway, I'm riffing way too long on this, but I just want you to understand that this is a challenge that we have in the alcohol field, and we are dedicated to working at what are the root causes of this high-intensity drinking, and what can we do to reverse it? And here's the data, okay? So these are alcohol-related emergency department visits for people aged 18 to 24 in the last 10 years, and it's a steady line increase. So while we seem to be making some progress in young people, particularly 12th grade and under, what can we do to reduce alcohol use among young people? How can we prevent peak levels of binge drinking leading to blackouts, overdoses, and deaths? And I've just talked about that. So one of the things we can do is design prevention strategies that address alcohol use by girls and women. How do we do that? And that's another challenge that we face. And another challenge is use our growing knowledge of adolescent brain development to tailor our prevention efforts. And I think there's a compelling argument here that biology now, or neurobiology now, gives us a completely legitimate reason for the 21-year-old drinking age. It's evidence-based information. So adolescence is a time of intense learning and preparation for adulthood, plasticity combined with a shift in control over behavior from regions that generate drives to regions that regulate drives. Reward circuitry seems tuned to provide a high signal-to-noise ratio, making the brain sensitive to and influenced by positive reinforcement. Kind of touched on that this morning. At the same time, the amygdala and other areas are involved in anxiety, stress, are highly active and reactive, which helps keep us safe and creates opportunities for learning from negative reinforcement. Alcohol provides both positive and negative reinforcement. And starting young increases the risk of developing an alcohol use disorder. There is actually evidence out there in this field, in our field, the alcohol field, showing that if you follow young people, they initially start with the positive reinforcement, and they have a bigger positive reinforcing effect of alcohol. The brain is created in such a way that they report a bigger positive reinforcing effect. But eventually, those individuals start switching into what I would call the dark side, the self-medication domain. And we also know that alcohol damages the developing brain. And in the damage of the developing brain is largely in the frontal cortex, and I'll come back to that. So it's really important that we delay and prevent the onset of alcohol or other use. And we ensure that young people develop healthy coping strategies and learn to find positive and negative reinforcement from healthy sources. And so, I hate to be so hard-nosed about it, but, hosting parties don't work. Hosting parties where you train, allegedly, your teenager to drink appropriately. First of all, the only people that come to hosting parties are binge drinkers. So what you end up doing is training your young person to be a binge drinker. And the data are out there, right? Secondly, people throw me the European model. I can tell you, I had the French ambassador tell me 2 years ago, he came up to me and said, "We have a very big problem in France with young people drinking, binge drinking." It's a fallacy. There is no such thing as the European model that actually trains young people to drink appropriately. Okay, and then the other part of the neurobiology that I think is critical is that you've seen these slides before, but I want to argue with you. You lose cells in your frontal cortex as you get older, as you progress through adolescence. And that's a culling mechanism, okay? So that you're solidifying circuits that are connected to the brainstem. And that's the bottom right-hand graph there where it says frontal white matter. This process doesn't finish until about the age of 25. And any of you that have raised a teenager know exactly what I'm talking about. We have a study called the National Consortium on Alcohol and Neurodevelopment in Adolescents. This study was the precursor to the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study. It's actually what triggered the interest in the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study. This is a cross-sectional prospective design of 800 individuals. They've been at it for about 5 years, and there's already data that brain regions where heavy drinking adolescents, where it shows that brain regions where heavy drinking adolescents have been measured have steeper reductions in gray matter volume than no low drinking adolescents. So on intake across this age range, because this is cross-sectional design, these are individuals at 11 to 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, et cetera, up through 21, 22. If you take those individuals and you divide them up into heavy drinking input to this study and no low or low drinking, you get significant differences in frontal cortex gray matter. So reductions. So this indicates that, yes, alcohol does impact the adolescent brain. Led by the National Institute on Drug Abuse and ourselves and NCI, and now a herd of other institutes at NIH, have launched the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study. Since Wilson didn't talk about this, but we have now, this slide's slightly out of date, there's over 12,000 individuals at 9 to 10 years old who have been imaged and neuropsychological tests. They're being followed with the imaging every 2 years, the neuropsychological tests every year. This study is underway and recruited. And it's, I think it's really impressive. And there are already data, and the data have been uploaded into the NIMH data archive. And the first data are available there for half of the subjects. And there's actually real data showing that, you can argue this is trivial, but it's also interesting. We already know that about 60% of these individuals at 9 to 10 years old have been offered a sip of alcohol, okay? And take that into account with what I talked about earlier about setting standards. Some other success rates have been that the fact that there have been, significant reduction in alcohol-related deaths associated with drunk driving since Reagan signed the 21-year-old drinking law into effect in 1988. This is another major success story. And one of the successes in that really has to do with this younger group, because they are one of the groups that have shown more dramatic effects, as I just showed on the slide. So how do we prevent underage drinking? Well, you have to consider a whole bunch of factors. There's genetics, obviously. There's personalities, the rate of maturation and development. There's gender, as we talked about all day today. Level of risk, social factors, environmental factors, other substance use, as Wilson was talking about. We know that there are core elements of prevention that actually work, okay? There are environmental approaches. Limit the access to alcohol. Enforce the minimum drinking age of 21. I was in the supermarket in California, and some poor lady who was my age was trying to buy a bottle of wine, and she didn't bring her driver's license. She only bought her credit card, and the guy wasn't going to sell her the wine, all right? That's an effective environmental intervention, all right? We all laugh, but that means that kid who was at the counter, and I heard him say to her, "I'm sorry, lady, but there's a camera watching me, and if I get caught selling you the wine without carding you, I'm in trouble." So, the punishment wasn't on the person buying the wine. The punishment was the guy who was selling the wine. Anyway, so zero tolerance laws, these are environmental, and they work, all right? You decrease the number of outlets around a college campus, you decrease the number of problems associated with alcohol. There's individual level. Change the way young people think about alcohol so they are better able to resist the pressures to drink. This is a big issue. I mean, most of your children who went to school probably got alcohol EDU. It's a program. It's been shown to be effective. It's given to freshmen when they come into college, but do they follow up in the college with these individual or university with these? And these are all school-based. But what about non-college students? This is a whole gap in an area that we need to look at NIAAA. And then, I've already talked about the school-based part and the individual part. And then, Wilson got a question about the families, and I agree totally with everything Wilson said, but I'm going to add on to that family therapy and family-based interventions can also be effective, particularly because of that issue of self-regulation, where in self-regulation there are three elements: standards, monitoring, and strength. But standards is a big part, and if the standard at home is excessive alcohol use, that's what the child's going to pick up. Anyway. What are we doing? Well, I told you about College AIM. We have a menu out there. Every college and university in the country has gotten this product. It has the environmental interventions. It has the individual interventions. It rates them. It provides the data to support it, and it provides how much money it costs to apply that to your particular college. We need to do this outside of the college domain, and that's an area we're exploring at NIAAA. Screening and brief intervention works, and you've heard a lot about that today, quite a lot. It works. And we have 6 grants out examining whether it works in adolescents. The data so far indicate that it works in adolescents as well. This is for alcohol. I'm talking about alcohol. And then we do have a guide that's out there, so that supports the evidence for screening and brief intervention, and you can find all that information in our youth guide. And then, obviously, you've heard about this. Physician visits allow an opportunity for screening and brief intervention, and we're hopefully through ASAM and everything ASAM does, this is starting to catch on throughout the United States. And we do have a policy research program at NIAAA. We prefer to focus on grants that are examining the effectiveness of different policies. But we also support the APIS contract, and currently that contract, the Alcohol Policy Information System, is also constructed to take care of changes in marijuana laws and changes in alcohol laws. So hopefully researchers who are interested in these kind of policy effects can start to compare what happens in states where there's a change in marijuana laws and or not a change in alcohol laws. And I'm a little over, but thank you very much. And I found my water. So. Did I have questions? I guess I did.
Well, you have, I think you got your ARS questions, I believe.
Yeah, all right. So let's go with this one. The frontal cortex does not fully develop in human beings until what age range? Do I click something or do you do it? Oh, here you go. I expected everyone to get that one correct. We've talked about it quite a lot. A new scientific study evaluating the incidence of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder shows levels in the United States that range from, well, this wasn't in my talk, but it was in an earlier talk, so we'll go with it. Yay. You got that one right. And then, which of the following are evidence-based effective components of prevention of underage drinking? Environmental, individual level, school-based, and family-based interventions, individual-based interventions, and DARE. Only individual level and family-based interventions, only more severe judicial punishment. Well, everybody got that too. So you'd see I'd be a great teacher. You all get A's. So if there's time and any questions, I'm happy to deal with them. Okay. Can you talk about the basics program at the University of Washington intended to teach college students, non-alcoholic, how to drink safely? I'm not familiar with that particular program, to be honest with you. If they're of legal age level, I would be all for that. And I've always made the argument that the Greek system, both male and female versions, could be very useful in helping young people who are of age, 21 and older, drink appropriately and structure their social functions in an appropriate way. Do you think that lifelong exposure to parental family substance abuse is correlated with increased incidence of suicide, depression in teens and young adults? I would say probably yes, from what I know of abuse and alcohol use disorder. I think, I've personally been looking into the deaths of despair. Nora Volkoff and Josh Gordon and I have been talking about it together. I think there's a strong correlation in the deaths of despair with suicide, with affective disorder, and depression, with overdoses, and on both alcohol and opiates, but also cirrhosis, liver disease. And those things tend to be correlated. When you talk to Angus Deaton and Ann Case, who did those studies, and I asked them personally, what about in the UK, where they don't have an opioid crisis of as big as in the United States? And what they told me was, in the UK, the deaths of despair, the drug that's involved is largely alcohol. So yes, is the answer.
Here's a good question. I think this one.
If adolescence is not a good time to begin moderate consumption of alcohol, at what age would you say is acceptable to engage in moderate consumption? After you've given 3 talks at ASAM. I hope nobody recorded that.
You're being live streamed.
I'm live streaming. Oh, great. For some individuals, there is no appropriate time to begin moderate drinking. And let me give you a couple of examples. One example that I did want to say, so this gives me a time to riff on this a little bit. So if you're Asian origin, you have about a 30% chance of having missing an allele for acetaldehyde dehydrogenase, okay? If you're missing that allele and you drink, you're going to have a flush reaction. Most of you have probably heard of that. It's very similar to what happens if you drink on top of disulfiram, all right? And it's presumably caused, I think it's been largely proved caused, by spikes in acetaldehyde in your bloodstream. But if you drink past that, if you take antihistamines to cut down the flush reaction, the uncomfortableness, the face going red, the high increase in blood pressure, if you take some kind of medication or something to overcome that so you can drink more, you try to drink past this acetaldehyde blockade, you have a 10-fold higher likelihood of esophageal cancer, right? And that's a study by none other than David Goldman, who's our clinical director at NIAAA and also a world-famous geneticist. So, I put that out there because I remember Bin Gao came up to me, who's one of our also world-celebrated researchers on liver disease in our intramural program in NIAAA, and Bin is Asian. And Bin said to me, he gets the flush reaction. He said, George, there's no safe amount of alcohol for me to drink. If I drink a little bit of alcohol and try to drive a car, I'm dangerous. I would be dangerous in a car, not because I'm intoxicated, but because I get dizzy from the acetaldehyde. And this is sort of you may consider it a banal example, but there are plenty of other individual differences and vulnerabilities that may make you not want to ever drink. And breast cancer would be another one for women, all right? Just as an example. So I think this is an individual decision on each person when if they ever want to drink. I know plenty of my friends who've joined Al-Anon because their parents had severe alcohol use disorder, and they never drank. And they lived happily ever after.
Are you familiar with what Iceland did to curb alcohol and drug use in their...
Yeah, I'm a little bit familiar with the Iceland story. To be truthful, I want to go to the original sources, but what I understand they've done is there were a lot of the prevention elements that I put up on the screen. But because they're a small country and they can regulate everyone, it would be kind of like doing something in Rhode Island, although I'm not sure Rhode Island would even put up with what they did in Iceland. But it's a small country. And so they had curfews for the kids, I know that. They had education programs. They provided alternative sources of reinforcement. So there were a lot of sporting events and alternative things for the children to do after school. So there were a whole bunch of elements like that involved the healthy aspects of a prevention program for a healthy lifestyle. It wasn't just focused on alcohol and punishing young people for their use of alcohol. And I confess, I don't know a whole lot more about it, but it has been very effective, and it's certainly something that I think could be used in a community in the United States if the community got together and decided they wanted to institute those same kind of prevention programs.
All right, I think we're it.
Okay.
We've done it.
Well, thank you very much.
All right. I'd like to thank Dr. Compton and Dr. Koob for their excellent presentations today. Dr. Koob gave 3 presentations. I think we ought to give him another round of applause. You've all earned a break. Come back at 4 o'clock.